In the opulent chambers of Madrid's Royal Alcazar, November 6, 1661, should have been a day of triumph. After years of fragile heirs, miscarriages, and whispered fears of divine punishment, Queen Mariana of Austria finally delivered a son and heir to the Spanish throne. But when the child was placed in her trembling arms, celebration turned to horror. This was no cherubic infant to inspire confidence in the dynasty's future. His head was grotesquely large, his lower jaw jutted forward at a shocking angle, his tongue too heavy to remain inside his mouth. His skin carried a waxy pallor, his eyes wandered vacantly. The courtiers who witnessed his first cries paled, exchanging silent glances that spoke what no one dared say aloud. Spain's empire, the mightiest in the world, had been entrusted to a child who already seemed broken. The midwives, hardened women who had delivered dozens of royal infants, could not suppress their horror. Physicians muttered prayers under their breath. Some whispered that this child's survival was not a blessing but a curse. Mariana, exhausted from a brutal labor, gazed upon her son with a mother's conflicted heart love tangled with terror. She fainted. Court records later softened to say from exhaustion, though the truth was plain. The sight of her own child's deformities had undone her. Yet, as soon as she revived, she swore to protect him, to shield him from a world that would call him a monster. Her devotion would shape the rest of her life, but also chain Spain to a tragic fiction that this fragile boy could one day rule an empire. Word of the newborn spread quickly, carried by ambassadors to the courts of Europe. In Paris, Vienna, and London, monarchs read the reports with astonishment and unease. Behind closed doors, they laughed or shuddered. Spain, the empire where the sun never set, had produced an heir who could not even close his mouth. Foreign diplomats circled like vultures, sensing weakness. Yet Charles's birth was no accident of fate. He was the living culmination of 2 centuries of dynastic obsession, where uncles married nieces, cousins married cousins, and generations tangled themselves in a genetic trap disguised as political genius. What the world saw that day was not merely a sickly child, but the embodied price of empire, a dynasty eating itself from within. For Spain, this was not the beginning of renewal, but the quiet toll of a funeral bell. The boy who should have guaranteed the Habsburg legacy would instead become its executioner, not by will or malice, but simply by existing. His very body was a declaration. The golden age of Spain had reached its cursed twilight. To understand why one child's body could bear the weight of an empire's ruin, we have to rewind to the moment Spain seemed invincible. In 1516, a teenager named Charles, grandson of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, gathered crowns, the way conquerors gathered cities. As Charles I, Spain, and later as Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, he presided over a realm where courtiers bragged that the sun never set on his dominions. Silver caravels plowed the Atlantic, disgorging new world treasure into Seville's counting houses. Armies tramped across the Low Countries and Italy. Spain's piety and steel moved in lockstep. It was not merely a kingdom, it was a weather system. That weather felt like destiny. Under Charles, and then his son Philip II, Spain perfected a choreography of power processions, autos de fe, court ceremonials designed to convince the world that God himself had signed the Habsburg patent of rule. At San Lorenzo de el Escorial, Philip raised a granite sermon in stone, palace, monastery, mausoleum, and machine of state, fused into a single austere statement. Here was Catholic monarchy made architecture cold, orderly, and sure of its eternity. The fleet Philip hurled against England, the Great Armada, sailed as much on theology as on wind. Even its defeat could be absorbed into the narrative of testing and endurance. Spain still had Naples, Milan, the Netherlands, the Philippines, American viceroyalties, an empire latticed by prayer and bullion. But beneath the polished marble of triumph ran hairline fractures. The same brilliance that unified crowns also welded bloodlines. Each dynastic treaty tightened the loop. Habsburg married Habsburg to keep maps from being redrawn by in-laws. What began as prudence better in Nice, then a rival hardened into doctrine. Marriage became a fortress to keep the empire whole, and the price of that fortress was paid in chromosomes. Still, in the mid-16th century, no one in the royal chapel could hear that future ticking. Velázquez would later paint kings whose faces carried that famous jaw like a badge. Courtiers would bow to portraits as if to altars. The bullion convoys kept arriving. The painters and poets El Greco's soaring saints, Cervantes' wounded knights wrapped the age in a halo that made it hard to see the shadows pooling at the edges. The Habsburgs had built a miracle of continuity, territories locked to a family locked to itself. It kept borders steady and thrones secure until the walls curved inward, until the fortress became a cage. That is the irony at the heart of Spain's golden century. The very system that guaranteed permanence planted the quiet seed of extinction. And one November night in 1661, that seed bloomed in a cradle. When Philip III ascended the throne in 1598, Spain still glittered in the eyes of Europe. The galleons arrived heavy with silver, cathedrals echoed with triumphal chants, and Madrid swelled with a grandeur befitting the world's most powerful court. Yet beneath the incense and treasure lay rot. Philip was a monarch without appetite for rule. Where his father Philip II had been austere and tireless, Philip III was pliant, content to hunt, to pray, and to leave the business of empire to favorites and ministers. In this complacency, Spain's first cracks widened. The Dutch revolt, simmering for decades, bled the treasury. The 30 Years' War drew Spanish arms into conflicts that drained men and coin alike. Even the flood of silver from the Americas, once a fountain of wealth, now poisoned the empire. Inflation surged, prices soared, and dependence on colonial riches left Spain vulnerable to every disruption on the seas. What glittered in the coffers was in truth quicksand, pulling the empire down with every ingot unloaded in Seville. But it was in Philip himself, and in his children, that the most insidious decline showed. Though not yet the grotesque spectacle that Charles II would embody, the hereditary curse was visible in fragile bodies and shortened lives. Many of Philip's children died in infancy, a grim drumbeat of tiny funerals, muffled by state ceremony. Those who survived bore signs that courtiers whispered about, but never named: lethargy, ill health, and a jaw that seemed to grow sharper with each generation. The king's marriage to his cousin Margaret of Austria deepened the entanglement of the bloodline. What had been political prudence was becoming pathological repetition, a family tree curling inward. Courtiers and physicians saw what they could not publicly say, that chance and God were no longer solely to blame for the cradle's grim harvest. It was the dynasty itself that was killing its heirs. Meanwhile, the court grew ever more ceremonial, as if etiquette could smother anxiety. Elaborate rituals dictated when a monarch might speak, when a servant might approach, when even silence should be observed. Such pageantry created the illusion of stability while concealing that the monarch himself was drifting. Decision-making passed to a handful of favorites, most infamously the Duke of Lerma, who treated the empire less as a sacred trust than as a ledger to be plundered. Foreign ambassadors began sending home veiled reports that Spain's kings were weaker, less imposing, more strange. But abroad, awe still clung to the Spanish name, and so the warnings went unheeded. The empire seemed unassailable, but in its nurseries, in the private despair of queens, the truth was already written. Spain was not only bleeding on the battlefield, it was bleeding in its very blood. By the time Philip IV inherited the throne in 1621, the Habsburg Empire was already wobbling under the weight of war debt and a crumbling economy. Yet to the outside world, Spain still radiated magnificence. At court, Diego Velázquez painted the monarch in sober dignity, his brush smoothing over what reality could not hide. A man burdened by a jawline that betrayed centuries of tangled kinship, and a mind increasingly clouded with fatigue and melancholy. Philip was not entirely without gifts. He adored theater and patronized artists, leaving Spain a cultural legacy that glittered even as its power dimmed. But he lacked the iron discipline of his grandfather, and as the empire faltered in wars against France and the Netherlands, Philip clung to ritual and illusion. The Escorial echoed with prayers, yet every petition seemed to fall on deaf heavens. It was his marriage, however, that sealed the dynasty's doom. In 1649, Philip, then middle-aged and weary, wed his niece, Mariana of Austria, a girl barely 14. It was a union not of romance, but of arithmetic. Cousins and uncles marrying nieces to keep Europe's chessboard frozen in Habsburg favor. The genealogists could have traced the coils of shared blood like a strangling vine, but in Madrid, politics trumped biology. What they called prudence, nature called suicide. The results were devastating. Mariana endured pregnancy after pregnancy, most ending in miscarriages or stillbirths. The rare infants who lived bore fragile frames and haunted eyes. Courtiers whispered of curses, of God's wrath, even of sorcery. Each tiny coffin carried not just a child but another portion of Spain's future. By the 1650s, rumors grew so persistent that they seeped into the public. Why did so many royal children die? Why did the survivors look so unlike the portraits Velázquez painted? In private, courtiers confessed that the line seemed poison. In public, priests thundered that Spain's misfortunes were divine chastisements, urging ever more piety, more fasting, more processions to cleanse the nation's sins. Amid this atmosphere of dread, Mariana's pregnancies took on the weight of national prophecy. Every swollen belly was the empire's last hope, every labor a gamble with destiny. When a healthy-looking daughter, Margarita Teresa, survived past infancy, the court exhaled in relief, only to betroth her to her own uncle, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I. The cycle of inbreeding would not stop. It deepened with each generation, an empire tightening the noose around its own throat. And then, in 1661, Mariana carried a child again. Her body was frail, worn from loss, and her physicians noted strange complications. Some whispered she seemed cursed, her womb rejecting life itself. Few could admit what was already obvious. The child she carried would not be a savior, but the embodiment of a dynasty's destruction. That child was Charles II. The bells of Madrid should have rung with joy when Prince Charles was born in November 1661. Instead, they tolled like a funeral dirge. The infant was immediately recognized as different, not merely weak or small, but disturbingly malformed. His head was abnormally large, his lower jaw jutted grotesquely forward, and his swollen tongue protruded permanently, making it nearly impossible for him to nurse. Physicians designed strange contraptions to feed him, silver spoons and tubes that turned nourishment into a ritual of desperation. Every meal was a battle for survival. Court protocol moved quickly to smother the truth. Only the most trusted attendants were permitted near the child. Portraits were commissioned, painted with careful flattery to disguise his deformities. In them, Charles appeared delicate, perhaps even princely. But those who saw him in person whispered of a child who looked less like a future king and more like a warning carved into flesh. Foreign ambassadors, always probing for weakness, wrote in secret reports of a prince whose body seems already conquered. The Queen Mariana devoted herself wholly to the child. She wept in private letters preserved in Spanish archives, confessing her terror that God had cursed her womb. Yet in public, she shielded Charles with ferocious determination. She refused to let the court call him a monster, insisting instead that he was God's chosen heir. Her maternal devotion, however noble, also became a trap. It demanded the entire empire uphold the fiction that Charles was fit to rule. The boy's early development only deepened the despair. Where most infants reach for their mothers, Charles stared with vacant eyes. Where others learned to crawl, he remained limp, his spindly limbs unable to bear weight. When he finally managed to shuffle forward in childhood, it was with a halting, stumbling gait that required constant attendance to prevent injury. His speech never matured beyond garbled, slurred sounds, intelligible only to those closest to him. Courtiers grew adept at translating his noises into polite words for ambassadors, maintaining the illusion that Spain's heir had a functioning mind. Behind the tapestries of the Alcazar, medicine offered no answers. Physicians bled him, prayed over him, and prescribed exotic remedies: ground pearls, bezoar stones, even elixirs brewed from strange animals. Nothing worked. Priests, meanwhile, muttered that this was God's punishment for Spain's sins, or more dangerously, for the dynasty's incestuous pride. The Inquisition silenced such whispers with threats, but silence could not undo the evidence in the royal nursery. By the time Charles reached 5 years old, the truth was undeniable. The boy who carried Spain's destiny could neither walk nor speak like other children. He had survived against all odds, but his survival felt less like a miracle and more like a judgment. The court consoled itself with lies, the queen with faith, and the empire with ceremony. But behind every prayer and portrait lurked the same dread. Their heir was a shadow of a king. When Philip IV died in 1665, Spain awoke to a nightmare it could no longer postpone. The crown passed to his 4-year-old son Charles, a child so frail and malformed that many doubted he would survive the coronation. Yet the ritual proceeded, staged with desperate precision. Courtiers steadied his ungainly body. A specially fitted crown was lowered onto his swollen head, and words he could not pronounce were spoken for him by others. It was less a coronation than a pageant, a kingdom trying to convince itself that it still had a king. In reality, Spain had none. The regency fell to Queen Mariana, whose devotion to her son blinded her to the truth. She ruled in his name, issuing decrees and arranging audiences where Charles appeared briefly before being whisked away. For foreign ambassadors, these encounters were shocking. The French envoy wrote that the boy resembles more beast than prince, while the English described him as afflicted with a madness that makes governance impossible. Their reports spread through Europe like gunpowder, igniting the first sparks of opportunism. Rivals who once trembled at Spain's might now smell blood. The machinery of empire, once so formidable, began to falter. Rebellions simmered in Sicily and Naples, while France under Louis XIV pressed its advantage, seizing territories in the War of Devolution. Spain's armies, leaderless and underfunded, suffered defeat after defeat. The empire that had been bound together by the iron will of Charles V and Philip II now unraveled under the reign of a child incapable of lifting a sword, let alone commanding men. At court, the charade deepened. Documents requiring the king's signature were guided by attendants who moved his hand across parchment. Proclamations were issued in his name, though he could barely form coherent words. A bureaucracy of secrecy developed, designed not to govern but to conceal. Servants sworn to silence, portraits painted with flattery, ceremonies constructed to hide the truth of a monarch who could not function. Meanwhile, the people of Spain began to whisper. Rumors spread that the king was cursed, that his deformities were divine punishment for centuries of pride and blood marriage. Priests muttered about God's wrath, and the Inquisition tightened its grip, determined to silence any suggestion that the dynasty's weakness was hereditary. Yet even faith could not disguise the evidence. Famine, inflation, and corruption eroded the empire from within. As Charles grew older, his presence at court became a living contradiction. He was king in name but absent in reality. Foreign diplomats circled like vultures, Spanish nobles schemed over succession, and the people looked to their monarch and saw only a husk. The throne of the world's mightiest empire was occupied by a boy who could not rule, a symbol of Spain's grandeur collapsing into decay. By the late 1670s, Charles had stumbled into adulthood, though his body and mind remained that of a broken child. Yet the question of heirs became impossible to ignore. The Spanish court, desperate to preserve the Habsburg line, looked across Europe for a bride who might bear the miracle Spain needed. Their choice fell on Marie-Louise of Orleans, a French princess barely 17, niece to Louis XIV. Her marriage to Charles in 1679 was meant not only to continue the dynasty, but to bind Spain and France together in a fragile peace. The wedding, staged in all its grandeur, was a theater of illusions. Courtiers steadied the king through the vows, guiding his movements with practiced subtlety, while his speech, incomprehensible to many, was translated into solemn declarations. To the crowd, it was a ceremony of dynastic triumph. To those closer, it was an exercise in denial. Behind closed doors, Marie-Louise faced the reality of her new husband, a man with bulging eyes, swollen jaw, and childlike mannerisms. Her private letters describe a life of horror and loneliness, trapped in a union that could never be fulfilled. The court, unwilling to accept the obvious, whispered prayers for an heir and reported each passing month with strained optimism. Physicians forced concoctions upon the queen, herbal remedies, and even bizarre rituals designed to quicken conception. Some even suggested her diet be filled with stimulating foods, as if fruit and wine could undo centuries of genetic rot. But Marie-Louise never conceived. She withered under the pressure, her beauty fading into melancholy. By 1689, she was dead at the age of 26, her sudden passing blamed on poison by rumor-hungry courtiers, though modern historians point instead to illness brought on by stress and despair. Undeterred, the Habsburgs arranged another marriage, this time to Mariana of Neuburg, a German princess famed for her strong constitution and fecund family. If any woman could bear an heir, it would be she. Yet the reality of Charles's condition made the hope laughable. Their marriage in 1690 followed the same absurd choreography as the first, with courtiers propping up the king as if he were a puppet. Foreign diplomats wrote with barely concealed astonishment at the spectacle of Europe's most fragile monarch attempting to sire an heir. Like her predecessor, Mariana quickly discovered the futility of her role. Charles's body was too weak, his anatomy too malformed. Physicians pretended to monitor her for signs of pregnancy, but the charade fooled no one. Her letters home spoke of frustration, despair, and even disgust at the infantile behavior of her husband, who by then suffered frequent seizures and lapses of awareness. By the end of the 1690s, it was clear there would be no heir. The Habsburg line in Spain had reached its dead end. The empire, once held together by blood, now teetered on the edge of dismemberment. And all of Europe watched, waiting for the final candle of Spain's dynasty to flicker out. As the 1690s waned, Charles II was no longer merely frail, he was a ruin in flesh. His body, warped by generations of incest, betrayed him piece by piece. He endured seizures that left him foaming and rigid, sudden lapses into unconsciousness, and a wasting frame that seemed more specter than sovereign. Foreign envoys who glimpsed him in these years wrote home with horror. One described a king fed like an infant, drooling and insensible. Another claimed he looked more corpse than man. Even the most skilled court painters could no longer disguise the grotesque distortion of his Habsburg jaw. Spain itself was collapsing in tandem with its monarch. The once mighty navy rotted in its harbors. Silver fleets from the Americas dwindled, choked by piracy, corruption, and rebellion. Provinces that had once trembled before Madrid's authority now defied it openly. Nobles carved out private fiefdoms, foreign armies plundered Spanish soil, and the treasury rang hollow. The world's first global empire was being hollowed out from within, its crown perched upon a head too weak to lift it. Even in death, Charles was not his own master. Factions at court schemed to control his will, knowing it would decide the fate of half the world. Some pushed for an Austrian heir to keep the Habsburg line alive, others for a Bourbon prince to deliver Spain into France's orbit. Charles, incapable of grasping the complexities, was manipulated like a pawn, his hand guided to signatures he barely understood. In 1700, the dying king named Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV, as his successor, effectively handing Spain to its greatest rival. On November 1, 1700, Charles II exhaled his last breath within the Alcazar of Madrid. He was 39 years old, though his body looked twice that age. Priests performed elaborate last rites, whispering prayers to a man who could no longer comprehend them. Outside, the empire trembled, couriers already racing toward Paris, Vienna, and London, with news that would ignite the War of Spanish Succession. His death was not just the end of a man but the extinction of a dynasty. The Spanish Habsburg line, which had once ruled continents, now lay in a coffin carried out of the royal palace. It had not been broken by battlefield defeats or foreign invasions, but by the slow, relentless erosion of its own bloodline. The obsession with purity, the fear of losing land through marriages to outsiders, had produced the ultimate irony: a king too weak to rule and a family too corrupted to endure. Thus ended the Spanish Golden Age not with trumpets of glory, but with the rasp of a dying monarch who embodied the genetic suicide of his house. Charles II was remembered by many as El Hechizado the Bewitched, yet the curse was not witchcraft. It was ambition, pride, and the cruel arithmetic of inbreeding. His life, tragic and grotesque, stands as one of history's starkest warnings that even the greatest empires can collapse not from without, but from within their own blood.